Hi YouTube, my name is Michael Berenger. I'm a medical doctor and a full professor of sports medicine and exercise physiology at Goethe University, Frankfurt, Germany. When schools test fitness, the idea sounds reasonable. Measure performance, compare students fairly, encourage activity, and maybe even motivate healthier habits. And in practice, schools often use structured fitness tests to do exactly that. In Germany, one example is the Obersberger Fitness Test. At first glance, it looks organized, practical, and efficient. Students move through 6 stations. Everything is timed, results are counted, points are added up, and in the end, a grade can be generated. But there is the real question. Does a test like this actually measure fitness in a scientifically meaningful way? Because that is where things get problematic. And it becomes even more problematic when teachers treat the result as if it were an objective measure of a student's physical fitness and then turn that result into a grade. So in this video, I want to break down the scientific weaknesses of a test like the Obersberger Fitness Test, not because testing movement is always bad and not because physical education should not assess performance, but because if you use a test, you should at least understand what it can measure and what it cannot. So let's do this. The official handout describes the Obersberger Fitness Test as a test that should provide a clear picture of each student's general conditional performance capacity. It also claims the test should reflect fitness objectively, cover a broad spectrum of conditional abilities, and allow high comparability through standardized conditions. That sounds impressive. But scientifically, those are big claims. And the first problem is this. The manual makes strong claims about objectivity and comparability, but it does not present scientific evidence for them. There is no discussion of validity, no discussion of reliability, no test-retest data, no measurement error, no explanation of how the scoring factors were derived, and no transparent normative database is available. Instead, the test uses 6 stations. Alternating step-ups, chest pass, box cross push-ups, step through with a stick, jump rope, heel-to-toe plank, and a line drill. And it counts repetitions, multiplies them with weighting factors, those are basically numbers that adjust how much each test contributes to the final score, and then converts the total into grading points. That may look quantitative, but numbers alone do not make a test scientifically valid. A calculator can turn almost anything into a score. That does not mean the score truly represents what you think it represents. And that brings us to the second major problem. This is not a pure fitness test. It is a mixture of fitness technique, coordination, and familiarity with that task. Take rope jump, for example. The test counts how many successful rope revolutions a student can perform in 45 seconds. This station is described as testing speed, endurance, and whole body coordination. But rope skipping is heavily influenced by practice. A student who regularly skips rope may perform much better than a student with similar aerobic or muscular capacity who simply lacks rhythm, timing, or rope skill. So what are you measuring? Fitness? Coordination? Experience? Motor learning? Probably all of them. And that means the interpretation becomes more messy. The same issue appears in the chest pass station. Students perform rapid chest passes against the wall for 25 seconds immediately after the bench step station, with no break between the two because it is treated as a double station. Again, this is presented as a speed task. But it is not just arm speed. It also depends on ball handling, coordination, rebound control, rhythm, and the ability to minimize lost time after imperfect catches. So once again, this is not a clean measure of one isolated physical quality. And this matters because teachers often look at the final number and think, now I have an objective measure of fitness. No, what you actually have is performance in a very specific set of tasks under very specific conditions. And that is not the same thing. Now let's move to the third problem. Several stations are labeled as if they measure one physical quality, but in reality they reflect multiple factors at once. Look at the step through with the stick, for example. The handout labels it as a test of mobility. But this is not just pure mobility assessment. It also is influenced by coordination, body proportions, balance, movement strategy, and familiarity with a pattern. So again, the label is much cleaner than the reality. The same goes for the heel to toe plank. The station is labeled as strength, endurance, or stabilization. But from a measurement perspective, it depends on trunk control, coordination, body awareness, movement economy, and how strictly the observer interprets good form. Which leads to the problem number 4, observer-dependent scoring. The test is presented as highly comparable because it is standardized, but many parts of the scoring depend heavily on human judgment. And in practice, students may even count repetitions for each other. That may be practical, but it clearly weakens the claim of objectivity. And that brings me to the 5th problem: fatigue contaminates the test. The students complete the stations in a fixed order, so performance in later stations is influenced by prior exertion. That means this is less likely a clean test battery and more likely a short circuit. And that is fine as long as you interpret it correctly and label it. But calling it an objective measure of general fitness becomes problematic. And now we get what I think is the biggest issue of all. That is, the test collapses very different abilities into one total score and then turns that into a grade. Speed, strength, endurance, mobility, coordination, all combined into a single number. But these are not interchangeable. So what exactly does the final grade represent? Probably a mixture, and that is precisely the problem. A mixed score can be useful for a class challenge, but it is much harder to justify when it becomes part of formal grading. Because then you're not just organizing activity, then you are judging students. And if teachers do not recognize the limitations, the risk is obvious. They may interpret the score as true fitness, which it is not. That is not a fair assessment. That is overconfidence in a weak measurement tool. And to be clear, I'm not saying schools should not test performance. Schools need practical tools. And the Obersberger Fitness Test is clearly designed to be practical and easy to implement. But practical does not mean valid. And standardized does not mean objective. And numerical does not mean scientifically meaningful. So here's the bottom line. As a school-based circuit, this test may have value. But as soon as it is treated as a scientifically robust measure of fitness, especially when grades are derived from it, the limitations become critical. Because then the real question is, do we actually understand what this test is measuring? And too often the answer is no. If teachers want to use such tests responsibly, they should recognize that they measure a mix of factors and avoid reducing everything to one score, and be very cautious when turning results into grades. Because once grades are involved, this is no longer just sport, it becomes an educational issue. So if you're a PE teacher, take into account that a PE grade should not only reward the physical abilities a student brings into a test. At least in Germany, there are even official guidelines for physical education that require a broader view. Learning progress, effort, participation, reflection, and the limits of performance measurement should also matter. So keep that in mind. See you soon. Bye-bye.